Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Tribe, Chair of the MFA Fine Arts Program here at the School of Visual Arts. And this afternoon, it's my pleasure to introduce the second of our three new faculty members this year, Chris Gray. Chris Gray is welcome. Welcome to Talks and welcome to SVA and to MFA Fine Arts. Speaking for myself, I'm just thrilled that you're here. So Chris is a transgender and interdisciplinary artist who uses their body as raw material, often presenting himself in states of extreme vulnerability as an invitation to experience transcendence or discover hidden queer histories. Their cultural work combines strategies of communication, activism, community building, education, lecture, and studio production in mediums 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, and 4-dimensional, that is time-based. An ardent collaborator, Chris co-founded and ran Gender Power with Maya Cherokee, Maya Cherokee from 2013 to 2023, a ripe decade. Gender Power uses storytelling and movement to question or reveal how participants experience authority based on the perceptions of their bodies. Chris has been a resident artist at the Bronx Museum, at Fire Island Artist Residency, Anti Festival for Contemporary Art, International Center for Training in the Performing Arts, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson, Arizona. Chris has filled a variety of professional roles in arts nonprofits, universities, and in the museum system industry, in museums, often in service of nurturing artists who experience marginalization within the worlds of contemporary art. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chris Gray.
Hi, friends. Okay, how's audio? Can we hear? Do we feel good about the levels? Okay, great. I'm going to bump this up so that our friends who are zooming in can see. All right, so you've heard a little bit about me. I'm here to introduce you to my practice through these sort of main themes of tension and tethers. And I am going to talk a little bit about my background and my training, but I guess I would couch what I do currently as social practice. And I would say I'm kind of heavy on the social and heavy on the practice. So we'll go through and we'll keep these themes of tension and tether in mind as I introduce myself to you. There I am again. So my name is Chris Gray. That's what you just heard. I also go by my given name, which is Kristen, and occasionally by the name Justin Credible. There you go. It's a bad sign when you start out with a wordplay joke and the audience is silent. So Justin Credible was my stage persona when I used to do drag. There were about 5 years where I did drag pretty consistently. And a lot of folks have asserted that drag saves lives, not just the folks in popular culture, but folks like Judith Butler, who've done a lot of academic work around framing the performativity of gender, and that we're all sort of performing ourselves all of the time. And then we have folks like RuPaul, who like to assert that we're all born naked and the rest is drag. So I have used my life and various stages and back rooms to explore the performativity of gender. I am pronoun flexible, which means I use all kinds of pronouns in reference to myself. They, he, she, all of those are good. You can feel free to switch around if you like. I was assigned female at birth, but I identify as non-binary. And we can understand my body through the lens of a transgender experience. I'm based here, along with probably many of you in the room, in Lenape-Hoking, traditional territories of Lenape and Canarsie people, and I live currently in Brooklyn, teach here at SVA as well as at Parsons. A little content note, there's going to be some stuff. We'll see some stuff. And that stuff includes some nudity, some needles, and some blood. Okay, when nudity tends to go over pretty easily, depending on my geographic location. But when we get to the part with the needles and the blood, that can conjure some somatic reactions. So I will pause again before we enter into the section that has a lot of that content, just to give you a heads up. But that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. And these experiences of being trans in a contemporary context have really formed not only my interactions with the world, but also my framework for understanding the gap between our identity, who we know ourselves to be, who we feel ourselves to be, and other people's perceptions of our bodies. So I've used that as a framework for entering my work, and I've also used it as a kind of tension between me and other folks who are not trans or who might have different bodily embodied experiences, but also as a way to create communities of affinity and tether a network together. So I'm going to start out with Rope Walk, which was a collaboration between myself and Rajni Shah. This was commissioned by Viva Art Action, which is a performance biennial in Montreal and Quebec. This took place in 2019. This was a pretty complex performance piece. And it ran for a couple of hours in this warehouse space. You can see us installed in the space here, each of us at different ends of a length of rope on the ground. And for this piece, I was assisted and advised by Tom Lauerman at Penn State, and he helped me understand and produce a 3D printed rope making machine, for which I was also supported and advised by my friend Jade Yu Meng. So we built this machine, I put it into a suitcase, and I brought it along with me to Canada. We used it to produce lengths of golden rope. The vision that we had for this performance came from a series of dreams or visions that both of us had. I had a dream where I was envisioning a sort of golden rope that connected Rajni and I across geography and time. And Rajni had a vision of two floating islands with a golden bridge connecting the two islands. And this highlights what has been always true about our relationship, is that we've always lived in different geographic locations, often very far away from each other. So we use this rope making machine to introduce tension into individual golden threads, thereby producing rope. Rope was a really interesting metaphor. Not only did it point back to our visions and dreams, but rope is the only thing that holds rope together is tension. So in order to create rope, which is exponentially stronger than its individual parts, you have to introduce tension into the individual fibers, and that causes the fibers to roll in on one another. They hold themselves there and thereby become much stronger. So we use this machine to create thin little golden ropes. And then we set that piece up along this track in the middle of a warehouse, and we packed it with sage, which was locally sourced by folks who were indigenous to that region that Rajni put us in contact with. And there was also a fuse wire that ran the length of this rope, which is kind of like in a cartoon where you see something go, it's so that's what we put into the middle of it. And at the culmination of this performance, at the end of the performance, we lit it on fire, laid on the ground, and there were sounds that were produced both by Rajni, who you'll hear vocally, and also by our collaborator Philly, who was lofted up into a deck above us. So I'm going to play this very short clip so that you have a little experience of what the audio sounded like in the space. All right. right, in the aftermath of that portion of the performance, we were left with this sort of smoldering and smoking line, which also left a sort of semi-permanent mark on the floor, thereby sort of memorializing this connection and creating a kind of smoke and sound bath for the people that were in the room that day. But Rajni and I didn't just arrive at this collaboration over a couple years of work. We actually began laying the groundwork for that collaboration a decade ago. So this is a picture of the first time that Rajni and I met. We were both on a panel and presenting performance workshops at CFIS. And so here we are, here I am with a full head of hair. That's how long ago it was. Rajni was then living in London. I was living in the United States. After that period, Rajni was living in Australia and now currently in Amsterdam. So we've always been geographically separated, but we've been staying connected since 2013 through all kinds of different exchanges, meeting up in different places so our bodies can be together, but also exchanging audio and text along the way. So it's like a decade of work that led up to this performance. And that sort of describes how I understand myself as a social practice artist, is that I exist in this network of creatives and cultural producers, each of us lending to one another's practice in lots of ways that are legible as well as illegible. So I want to sort of continue that theme through to 2012 when I did a residency at the Fire Island Artist Residency. Have folks heard of this residency program here in New York? Okay, a few people, great. Well, I'm glad I'm putting it on the radar for the rest of the room. This is the only art residency in the nation, which is dedicated to supporting LGBTQIA+ folks, so ostensibly queer identified folks. And this was my cohort that year. These are all folks that I have maintained contact with and been sort of tethered to for over a decade at this point. Jade Umang is the one on the left-hand side there. Jade is a fiber artist and teaches at SAIC. Jade was the one that advised me about how to build a rope making machine. And then the rest of my cohort there. Fire Island is a small barrier island. It's off the southerly coast of Long Island. This is where it's located geographically. It's sort of known colloquially as America's first gay and lesbian town, and it started to get that reputation in the early part of the 1920s. Because of its proximity to New York City, it was a place where a lot of folks who were involved in theater and the entertainment industry, who also just happened to be of the homosexual variety, would go out and they would be able to have sort of vacation space and time where it was possible to exercise their queerness a little bit more than it was possible in their daily lives. For those in the room who experience queerness in their daily lives, you might be familiar that there's a sort of scrutiny and surveillance around sexuality, which causes it at times to be completely outlawed or legislated against. And so at this time, it became a kind of destination for queer folks, or more pointedly, gay and lesbian folks. I don't think queer was being used in the same way that we use that terminology today. But because it became known for that, it also became a site of scrutiny and surveillance. So through the mid-century and into the 70s and 80s, it would be a very frequent event on the island where police from the mainland would take boats over and they would sweep the sections that were known to house queer inhabitants. So Cherry Grove, as well as the Pines, and then the forest that's in between, which is called the Meat Rack. It is a place where you can walk in between those two areas. If you were arrested in the 60s and 70s and even into the early 80s, it would be very common practice for your information to be distributed publicly via print media. So here I'm giving you a couple of different examples. If you're arrested under suspicion of homosexuality, for which Basically anything could constitute suspicion of homosexuality. You could be wearing clothing items that were associated with the sex that you weren't assigned at birth, for instance. Or you could be seen holding hands or interacting amorously with someone who was perceived to be the same sex or gender as you. If you were arrested during that time, it was pretty frequent that your name would be published in the newspaper, perhaps your home address, maybe information about your employment. And so the cost of being arrested was pretty enormous. You could lose your job, you could lose your housing, you could lose your family, you could lose a lot. So there was a lot at stake. So while I was a resident in Fire Island, I was using my social practice to meet up with folks who I affectionately refer to as island elders, people who are in their 70s, some of them into their 80s, who had been coming to Fire Island as a vacation and queer destination for a long time. And I wanted to find out about their experiences and how things had changed. And one story that I heard about inspired me so much. It was an experience that a person had when the police came to raid the island. He ran away to avoid police arrest, and he hid in the bay underwater and among the reeds, often submerging his body in water and breathing through a bamboo reed, which was a technique that he gleaned during the Vietnam War. So he was using these tactics to hide his body in order not to be arrested, and did a storytelling series in Cherry Grove a couple of years before I arrived there as a resident artist. And I was so compelled. In his telling of the story, he stayed in the water for several hours, hiding from the police until he felt it was safe to come out. And I was so struck by that image that it conjured in my mind, the image of a person submerged underwater, hiding and breathing through a bamboo reed. But I didn't want to do a sort of reenactment of that piece. I kind of wanted to pluck that thing out of my imagination that related to that story that I heard and reanimate it at a contemporary time. So here you'll see me entering into the pool at the Ice Palace, which is one of the main bars and social spaces in Cherry Grove. I ran this piece over a 4-hour duration, starting at 7 p.m. and ending at 11. And during that time, it was bright outside at 7 p.m. and by 11 p.m. it was completely dark. And over the course of those 4 hours, the pool became illuminated, thereby illuminating my single body. I stood underwater breathing through bamboo reed for 4 hours, and then folks were able to hang out on the deck around and watch. But I was really struck by what we might be able to glean about the history of scrutiny and surveillance in relationship to queer bodies and queer identity. And so this was an opportunity for me to mine history for a shadowed figure and to reanimate that figure through my own imagination, my own practice. And I'm going to show you another example of me mining history to look for a character. These are some images of Jean Carroll. She was the bearded lady at Coney Island in the for many years, and she maintained a kind of a friendship relationship with the person that you see pictured on the left-hand side here with her. He was a sideshow caller, and she was born in 1910. By the time she was 11 years old, she had a full face of naturally occurring hair, just because of the composition of her body and the specificity of her body. Which caused her to be able to be financially independent as a woman during a period of time when that wasn't the case for most women. So she was already always defying gendered expectations of womanhood for her time. And also in particular, I think the occurrence of facial hair that we assign so strictly to men or to masculinity, this is something that just occurred on her body and caused her to be able to move in a different way in the world. And so her affiliation was with the sideshow business and circus businesses. So by the time she was 13, she was traveling. She spent time in Barnum and Bailey's circus traveling, and she eventually landed at Coney Island, where she became the bearded lady. So this friendship that she maintained for over a decade with this person, the thing is that they had amorous feelings about each other, but they didn't feel like they could be together in a romantic way, precisely because of her presentation. Beard was just too different and too much. So she made a decision to permanently alter her body, which I like to think of as a kind of alternative transition. And she got an early form of electrolysis to remove her beard, and then she commissioned over 700 tattoos. So she transitioned from bearded lady to tattooed lady. Wow, such an inspiration. I mean, ostensibly, instead of altering her body in order to fit into the cultural conventions for womanness at her time, she chose to maintain an affiliation as an outsider in the sideshow business, and to take action on her body, which was permanent. And that to me speaks very loudly of a contemporary trans experience or a non-binary experience. There's a real adherence to the idea that trans people have a before and after. We love a transition story, right? A sort of before and after, rags to riches. So this idea, though, that trans people experience a transition, it seems pretty myopic to me, because I think we're all changing all the time. We're constantly becoming who we are. But to take permanent action on the body is not just a trans experience. There's a lot of ways that we alter our bodies over time. So that was the research that underpinned a serial piece in my practice called Procession. This is the first time that it was performed in 2013 for the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History here in New York City. You can see me, I am in Dumbo. I'm quite literally traversing the space underneath the bridge here. For this piece, I'm sort of nodding to Jean Carroll. I'm thinking about the ways in which, what I should say is finish that story up. So she got electrolysis, removed the beard, got a bunch of tattoos, and then she married. And those two stayed together until her husband's death. So it was in fact a move that she made to maintain her sideshow affiliation, but it also led to her being able to wed the person that she was in love with and who was in love with her as well. So inspired by that, I started to think about what if we take some of these markers of gender and sex on the body, and also these markers of transitional moments or states of union throughout a person's adult life, like a wedding. And so in Procession, I walk very slowly in a kind of wedding dress that I've sort of carved up and made into something of my own, a queer version of a wedding dress. You'll see me holding a bouquet of human hair instead of a bouquet of flowers. And in this piece, I just walk really slowly. So I sort of take one step every 20 or 30 seconds. And so the area underneath the bridge, this walkway, this path, it took me a little over 3 hours in order to walk end to end. And I do this piece when I do it in public. I usually choose locations where other people go to have their actual wedding or their actual wedding photographs. And when I'm lucky, I interact with wedding parties when I'm doing this sort of strange wedding thing all by myself. And this is an instance of that. I'm really kind of obsessed with public space and how the ripples of performance cannot be measured. It's impossible to know how you're affecting the visual landscape around you or the emotional landscape around you. But when I'm lucky, we get to have there's somewhere in someone's wedding album, there's a picture of me with this bride. She snatched that potted plant off of the table in the back. So I call it a serial piece because it's a performance that has a similar type of script, but that I have performed over and over and over again for many different contexts and many different places over just about a decade now. So a lot of the materials that I'll share with you today are not necessarily one-off performances. They're built from a craft lens, I have a background in ceramics. Both my undergraduate and graduate degree were conferred through ceramics programs. So I like to say, like, a potter enters the studio and they sit down at the wheel. The first vessel that they throw is never the best pot. The activity of iteration and reiteration is a part of the process. The process is so important. The outcome of spending time on the wheel might yield objects, but the process is really where the focus is. And so for me, process is really so important, even in social practice or performance. It's what I return to. And many of my performances are designed with that in mind, to be able to be reperformed over and over, so that I'm building for myself, hopefully several decades of content that shifts and change as the culture and context change around me. So in this iteration of Procession, I was commissioned by Wave Hill, which is a space up in the Bronx that has a really great series of public gardens and also a really brilliant art program and gallery space on site. I made a version of this performance in collaboration with Maya Cherokee, who is also my collaborator on Gender Power, another networked tether who I am linked to, where we help produce each other's work. And so in this iteration, instead of walking around in the public, this character is sort of haunting the empty spaces of Wave Hill. And I made this for the camera. It produced still images and video work. So it kind of busts up the idea that there's a union, there's only one figure, they never meet another figure. But all of our shoots and location selections were based on Wave Hill's marketing materials. It's one of those places that you can rent to have a wedding. So I based all of the shoot locations on the materials that they do marketing towards folks who might rent out for a wedding there. It was cold. Right. So, so that idea of like iteration, I referred very quickly to Judith Butler earlier. A lot of the work that I do is sort of taking what I've learned and what I like to explore theoretically and putting it into practice in performance. And iteration is related also to Butler's writing on gender performativity. And so I'm going to step us into another piece that is built with some of those similar parameters in mind. This is an untitled piece, which is an interaction with a cast of my torso. So you see me moving in and out of this floating object that's cast from life. I collaborated with Lania D'Agostino, who is Baltimore-based fine artist. And part of what she does is that she produces objects that go into museums, like figures in diorama. So she has a lot of life casting skills. My background in ceramics, I was my sort of specialty is mold making and slip casting. So I knew I wanted to cast my body and I had to collaborate with a team of people in order to do that. I cast my whole body, including my head, in 3 dimensions, 3 different times over 3 years, 2009, 2010, and 2011. Those also follow the early days of starting to alter my body and with the affects of the medical industrial complex. So I started taking testosterone in 2009. In 2010, we made a cast of my body 1 week before I had top surgery to reconfigure my chest. And then 2011, we cast my whole body in the form that looks closest to what I look like now. But in 2009, when we cast my body, I made a torso cast that was specifically like a kind of mask or a portal. And I perform with this piece still today. So this was one of the first iterations in 2012. In the performance, it is built in cycles. So I appear in front of an audience behind my cast, and I step into my former body. I'll stay there for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'll cycle out and I will stand with the audience gazing back. And so that is repeated on loop in the space of whatever time I have for performance. It could be 40 minutes, it could be an hour or longer. But I do that to sort of also intervene in this idea that that quote unquote transition is something about going from A to B. It's not linear. We're all changing all of the time. So my experience as a trans person is that changing my body brings me through different cycles. And then I have performed that piece, like I said, many different times in many different contexts over the years. And significantly, it was the first piece that I performed in what I'll call our COVID era. Remember that COVID? It's going on. Right. So for a couple of years, it was impossible to create live art or to do social practice in the way that I had been practicing before. And this was the first piece that I did back with a live audience at Sarah Lawrence College in 2022. So I continue to do this piece and it continues to change over time. But stepping back and forth between that kind of decade of practice, I also wanted to sort of talk about how my interface with systems of power and control kind of dictate what I can and cannot do with my body. And I wanted to touch back to something that's become really relevant to our current discourse, which is access to compassionate and competent healthcare. So when I was in graduate school, which was 2009 to 2012, which you might note also follows along that pathway of changing my body. I went to grad school, and then a month later, I decided to start testosterone. And then 3 years later, I had a completely new practice and a completely new body and no idea what to do with it. You know, I'm showing you work that is couched within visual art because here we are in the context of a visual art program. I want to also sort of touch into some of the ways that my work extends beyond the art world with a capital A, because I think there is an opportunity, and you might find an opportunity within your work to also intervene in culture and use your context to leverage for change. In my case, when I was a student, I was required to have the student healthcare coverage. And then I was denied coverage for anything that had to do with being transgender. And I found that out because each time I got billed for a new thing, I would push back against the insurance company. And each time I would get a denial letter, it would have a code written on it. And so the code was a clue, it was a key for us. And together with a bunch of other folks on campus, we formed a little cohort of people to push the university to change their healthcare coverage to include healthcare coverage for trans students, of which I was not the only one on campus. And so we worked together over 3 years to do that. That took me into places that I never imagined that I would be, into meetings and boardrooms and in front of the Graduate Student Senate and the Faculty Senate and the Undergraduate Student Senate to do what I'm doing here today, which is to connect my personal experience to a moment of cultural relevance and to ask for folks to get together to shift the culture around us to be more compassionate and to grant access to healthcare in parity. So in 2013, the first year that I wasn't a graduate student there, the university did change its healthcare coverage. And that was the first year that transgender individuals on campus at Ohio University were covered for trans healthcare. And then significantly, 3 years later, they extended that coverage through a great deal of push to the faculty and staff, which is me encouraging you to remember that on a college campus, the students outnumber everyone else. You are very powerful in this context. And that's a kind of a microcosm for what we understand culturally and politically on a larger scale. The people outnumber the politicians. And what we were experiencing on a local level at that time, I ended up sort of taking the materials I developed for those lectures, and I just would deposit them onto LGBTQIA plus centers on campus when I would do what I'm doing here today, which is pop up and give lectures at different places. I've been able to successfully track 5 other university systems where the students adopted those materials and were able to get healthcare coverage for trans students at their universities as well. That brings us to our contemporary moment. You might have noticed if you've turned on any news, any time, that trans is a household term. It's also a political leverage right now. And there's a great deal on the national level that we're seeing that's basically a scale to what I was experiencing on the local level at Ohio University. And that interface with one particular system of power and control, which is the medical industrial complex, makes its way back into my visual work and my performance work. This is an image of a theater piece called Body Dialectic. It's about a 45-minute or hour-long theater piece where I basically tell stories and connect different experiences to other culturally relevant issues of access and denial of access and how that affects our access to life chances. So this is the first iteration of Body Dialectic from 2012. This is a theater piece. It's easy to reiterate in some ways because theater, we already understand something gets produced and then perhaps that show travels or other people take up that show and reproduce that show. Folks from hundreds of years ago have written theater works that still get performed today. So that iterative process, which I think of as sort of coming from my craft-based experience, is really convenient for theater. What's also interesting about this piece, Body Dialectic, is I've performed it now internationally many different times over many years, and I've rewritten about 80% of the piece. So I think about a theater piece as almost being a score, kind of like that untitled piece with the torso where I can return to it and cycle through it. And so oftentimes I'll go back, I'll bite off something from my practice, I'll make a new iteration, rewrite or change some portion of it, but preserve the container of what the work is called so that it can continue to evolve and change through iterations. This piece has been performed in all kinds of different locations, and when it's filmed on stage, oftentimes those films are used as teaching materials. So in Croatia, actually, which is another place where I've performed this piece, the materials from that theater work have made its way into training modules for mental health care providers in training. So sometimes it happens outside of you. The materials of your practice get pulled into some other aspect of education or change making. But in this piece, I am holding the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I'm balancing it on my head, kind of like a Victorian era, like training for prim and proper girls. I'm balancing it on my head while I talk about interfaces of medicalization and pathology. So in order to have access to the medical industrial complex to alter your body with hormones or surgery, you have to be diagnosed with a mental illness. So this has been up for debate for a long time. And in terms of what we know about the DSM, which is that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that manual is also a living document. It changes over time. And it's notable in my mind that in the 70s, when there was a great push to remove homosexuality, which was once identified as a mental disorder in the DSM, in the 70s that was taken out. And very quickly after that, transsexualism was added to the DSM. So the target just shifted slightly away from sort of sexual activity and towards gender deviation. And we can see the echoes and the effects of this in the contemporary experience of transness. So I produced that theater piece, but because I'm the performing body in it, the images of that piece, when I saw the photographic documentation of that piece, I really felt inspired by this particular image of balancing the book on my head. And so I went back I bit off of that, and I cannibalized my practice a lot and reiterate images that I produced from my own performance work. And that's the case with precarity. Uh, when the first version of precarity that came after the theater piece was a video work, which is a looping video. It's actually playing right now, but I'm ostensibly standing still. You'll see my eyes blink every once in a while. But I'm standing still, balancing the book on my head, and that's an infinity loop. So when it's installed in an exhibition space, it's me in a constant state of precarious balance, which is a gesture that I use to sort of indicate how precarious my position is and how others experience precarity based on diagnostics. And after that video, I started to get requests to perform it live. And so I started to perform precarity just in this iteration, standing and balancing the book on my head as a live performance. So it's gone through all of those iterations and all of those different aspects, but it began when I took a look at the images from that theater work. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you a couple, two main last pieces of work from my practice. And this is the stuff that's going to get a lot more pointed when it comes to medicalization and its intervention on the body. And so I'm going to begin with Homage, which is a performance that I've done 3 different times in 3 different cities. This is a video documentation of the first time that I ran this performance. And this is the place where we're going to get into the stuff with the needles and the blood. Okay, so everybody take deep breaths. Remember to breathe. When I show this work as still images and video in this kind of context, like a lecture, it is not uncommon for people to pass out. So I'm going to ask you to exercise a little bit of care with yourself and with people around you. If someone falls out of the seat and we don't notice, would you send up a flare and stop us? It's okay. We can always pause and tend to someone. It's just it's a really interesting aspect of this work. When I perform it live, I've never had someone have that experience of passing out. But as it's reproduced in video and still images, it sometimes happens. Okay, so this is about a 5-minute clip of that performance, and we'll kind of scan through that performance so that you can get an idea of what it's like. Yes? It's totally up to you. Complete consent culture. If you
Out in the lobby with the part of the
totally. Yeah. Yeah, there's also not a lot of there's just sort of the ambient sound in the room with this piece. So there's not much in terms of what's happening that can be communicated in an audio sense. But you're also very welcome to close or cover your eyes if that feels comfortable. Okay, we feel good. We're ready to roll. All right. Mhm. Okay, great. We'll pop out and give them the go ahead. Okay. So in that video clip, basically what you're seeing, basically what you're seeing is my nude body installed on a plinth. I appear there with the needles already installed in my chest. It's a series of 10 piercings which run along my scar lines on my chest. And they function to lift up the scar line that is left there after the surgical intervention on my body. And then one by one, I go back and forth, switching sides to remove the needles, which then produces a drawing on my body in blood. But what happens behind the scenes before I arrive at that space is a part of my experience with this work. So the image that conjured this piece for me came from a dream that I had. There were 10 days in between the time that I had top surgery and the reveal of my new chest. And during those 10 days, I had wrappings on my chest and a compression vest. And also, I had drains installed, which were supposed to pull blood and fluid out of my chest. But in my case, they weren't functioning exactly that way. And so I was bleeding through the bandages on my chest, and I just had to wait for 10 days in that kind of state of anxiety and fear. It was the first time in my adult life where I didn't know what a part of my body looked like. And that unknown was very uncomfortable as well. And then 10 days later, I got the wrappings off and everything was attached and it was okay. And here I am in front of you. But for that 10 days, I had this like really deep fear that I didn't speak out loud to anyone else, but that visited me in my dreams every night. And that image was I was outside of my body watching my chest weep blood. And it was so terrifying that I never spoke it out loud until 2 years later, when I was in a performance intensive with Clifford Owens at Pioneer Works in Red Hook. And in that performance intensive, it surfaced, and I said it out loud to a group of people, and I said, I want to actualize that image, and I want to use the tools from the medical industrial complex in order to do that. And I also I didn't have any kind of kink practices or piercing practices to draw on. I knew I needed to collaborate with someone who could help me achieve that. And it was a time when one of my performance idols, Ron Athey, was visiting New York City, and he just happened to be performing at a place where I knew the people, and I went and I volunteered to paint the floor so that I could meet Ron Athey. And when I met him, I was like, okay, I'm doing this performance piece. Ron, if you aren't familiar with his work, I would highly recommend taking a look. A lot of extreme body work and a lot of blood. Ron is someone who's been HIV positive since the 80s, a long-term survivor, and who uses the material of blood in his practice a lot. So I went and painted the floor. I got to meet my idol, Ron Athey. I asked him, who do you know, or do you know anyone who I could collaborate who would do these piercings for me? And he said, I'll just do them. Like if you were asking the universe for a favor. That to me is a real standout moment of like queer mentorship in my practice. It's inspired me to involve lots of different folks, students and community members in the work that I do, precisely because there's this aspect of somatics, of practice that's involved in doing things together with each other. And so for two out of three of the times that I've done this work, I've collaborated with Ron ahead of time. And this is just a really quick clip of the private ritual that happens before the more public facing performance, in which Ron installs these needles in my chest and does a lot of body work and healing work. So what I'll also say is that although it involves needles and blood, my experience with this work is incredibly healing. And part of what I get as a gift from my practice is to be able to work with trauma responses and to shift my relationship to my own embodied experiences through performance and ritual and reiteration. Okay, so that's it for homage. Good, we made it through, we're breathing. Yeah, but do let them know that the next thing doesn't have a ton of needles and blood, but it does involve a little bit of piercing. Yeah, give them a shout. It's not as bloody though. And I promise to give everyone a little bit of a break coming up soon here. This is the last performance piece that we'll look at before a break. Yeah. Yeah. All right, my friends, one last piece to share with you, and then we're all going to get the opportunity to have a little break. So on this theme of medicalization and pathology, I want to share this last bit that's called labeled. Grows out of my research. I am primarily a researcher. There's my history and my experience that really informs my work, and then there's what I find in different archives. And so, as someone who is trans and non-binary, I'm very curious about the trans and non-binary folks who came before me. And they're not really present in the dominant canons of history making, but I'll tell you where you can find images of trans folks from over 100 years ago until today, medical and police archives. So the images of our bodies exist again in relationship to scrutiny and surveillance, sometimes in relationship to medicalization and pathology, sometimes in relationship to arrest. All of them systems of power that seek to control our bodies. And so in that research, I'm digging into medical and police archives to look for images of trans bodies. And in that research, I'm always very struck by how the trans body is treated in its imaging. And so in this instance, I'm sharing a couple of little bits and bobs from Harry Benjamin's The Transsexual Phenomenon. This is a book that also underpins Harry Benjamin's standards of care. Harry Benjamin's standards of care were set in place to help medical providers understand a pathway to being able to provide trans folks with medical assistance. In this book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which, by the way, if you're interested in taking a look through, this is from 1966. You can go ahead and Google this and you'll find a PDF for free on the interwebs. But go ahead in there and some of what you'll find in terms of imagery are these things that I'm sharing with you today. You might see, as is the instance for these images over here on the left-hand side, these images come from the same page. When the trans body is clothed, the face will be revealed. But on the very same page, if the body is nude, which is the case for what I have redacted below. If the body is pictured nude, the face is redacted. So you'll see these bricks that cover up portions of the trans person's body. And you see that over and over again. So you see in both of these images, moments where the face has been redacted, something's been added on in order to cover it up. But you will also find this fascinating turn, which is a series of images where over here on the right-hand side, this is, I think, the same trans subject as we see over here, but she's being positioned in the likeness of a statue of Hermaphroditus from antiquity. So a direct relationship to the art historical canon and the cis imaginary in terms of trans experience. So I couldn't even believe that when I found that in there. I was like, well, this is it. Like it's writing itself, isn't it? So this research has produced a new iterative performance in my oeuvre, and that performance is called Labeled. These images are from a performance in 2019 that happened at Grace Exhibition Space. And if you haven't been there yet, let me also put in a little recommendation for Grace Exhibition Space, a great place to go and see performance work and a great place to do performance work if that's something that you're interested in. Also significantly, when I went to paint the floor somewhere to meet Ron Athey, it was at Grace Exhibition Space. And I had met the owners and the curators of that space several years before at Art Basel in Miami through another friend. So the entire network produced the possibility of me being able to be in proximity to someone who is now a close personal friend of mine, Ron, and took someone who I idolized and adored from afar and created a really strong tether and connection to being a mentor and a friend in my adult life. So in this piece Labeled, I collaborate with another artist and performer, Leah James. I appear nude in front of an audience, and Leah uses suturing materials in order to sew a series of labels onto my body. Once the labels are sewn onto my body and installed, Leah takes a series of pictures of me in a state of being physically labeled that have a direct relationship to those images from police and medical archives, which I've just shown you. And then once she takes the photograph, she exits the space, and the next part of the performance is me removing each of the labels one by one and smashing them on the floor. This has an aspect of a sort of sonic reveal. There's not a soundscape that goes along with this piece. It's just the ambient noise in the room. But upon that first removal and smashing, it becomes obvious to the audience that these are not paper labels that have become installed on my body, but rather very thinly, finely crafted porcelain objects, which I make in my studio. So I go through one by one and remove those objects and smash them on the floor. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our formal lecture period. I've chosen things today that I hope sort of do the job of giving you a touch in to my practice, which is much wider than what you've seen today, but there's a ton more if you're interested in digging in on my website, including a bunch of different interviews and essays, writing that I've done and writing that other people have done about me, as well as other visual and performance art and social practice works. So I'll invite you to do that, digging in. You'll also find my email. If you just start typing in my name to your SVA email, you're very welcome to email through that portal. You can also find a contact page on my website. So we're going to have some time to hang out here and have a discussion. And I'll hear from you what things you're thinking about and feeling and are curious about. But beyond this time that we have together, if you're not currently my student at SVA, I hope you will be sometime soon in the future. But the invitation is open. We can continue talking about what I've introduced you here today into the future. So you're very welcome to contact me through there. And I hope we'll hear from you in the second part of our time today.